Our gospel reading from Matthew, as we continue the Matthew lectionary passages, has more parables. These parables reveal the kingdom of God's kingdom. Each parable has this line, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then an explanation, something that the people can grab onto and understand to help them see and understand, really, what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, the kingdom of heaven is an interesting thing. There are a couple different things that we call it. The kingdom of heaven, the heavenly realm, all of these different things. And I guess part of the short version of what that is that, well, it's when God sets up shop on earth. That's a part of it, anyway. The heavenly realm, the kingdom of heaven, it's this idealized place. This idealized time where all of the promises that God has given the people will finally fully come to fruition. And so these parables are seeking to explain what that is. And in these first two, they're beautiful. They're the happy stuff that'll really preach on a Sunday morning. He's talking to these people, this group of people, right? He's explaining to them what the kingdom of heaven is like. And I guess I always like Jesus using the parables because it's metaphors. And, I'm an English guy, and I appreciate that. And so the first one he does is he talks about the tiny seed, the mustard seed, which is very, very small. I don't know if you've ever seen one before, but it's incredibly tiny. And he says that this tiny seed creates a tree that's dozens of feet tall. And what he's doing is he's essentially saying, so the tree is God's empire, this heavenly realm that exists. And it starts off small. And we know that it starts off small because we're here, right? I mean, if you think logically about it, the movement of Jesus Christ began over 2,000 years ago with one guy and 12 of his friends. And we're here. It started off incredibly small, and it grew and it grew and it grew. How many other religions are fully practiced that have gone along in the world? Splinters and sects and things like that. These different notions, these different ways of looking at things. But a lot of them aren't fully practiced anymore. But we're here. We're here in that tree that God has built, this empire of this heavenly realm that God has created that exists for us. And what's fascinating here is that while we have the beautiful metaphor of, something small turning into something big, like that makes sense, like we can grasp onto that, there's this other line that's also really important, which is that this empire, this heavenly realm, creates shelter for God's creation. And so this impossible thing that probably shouldn't exist the way that it does, because it started very small but somehow is massive and big, it has this notion, this connotation of creating shelter and peace and a home for people. Some of the most important things in the world, the birds, because that's what God's love does. So then we get the yeast thing, and we kind of get this, that yeast is very small again, but this small thing creates a large transformation. If you've ever baked bread with yeast, you know that. That's actually one of my favorite parts about baking bread, is that, what I do is I always proof the yeast for about 5 minutes, so it smells like nice and kind of like champagne, brewery style. And that's when I know it's really working well. And then you put in the flour and everything else. Well, you got to whisk the dry ingredients together first. You're supposed to. And then, depending upon what I'm making, there's, seasonings that go in, garlic, and you mix it all up, and you knead it sometimes. And you get it to where it's a little bit sticky, but not too sticky. You don't want it too sticky. And then you cover it with a wet towel, and you set it aside for an hour. I like doing this in the summer because then I can just go outside and let it sit outside and just kind of shoo the bugs around, because the heat and stuff makes it rise. And so what starts off as this like tiny lump of dough, I get it and I look at it and I'm like, this is big. Like when I bake bread, sometimes I have to make like a lot of stuff. Especially like when I do my flatbread or my pizza and calzones, like I double or triple the recipes easily. And so what always winds up happening is I get the bowl after the hour and it's like bubbling up over top, like some kind of like the explosion had gone off. And I'm like, that's not how much I had. I had like half of that, but that's the point. That's the point, that something small, something that is counted aside and cast away, something that doesn't seem very important, it created this big transformation, because that's what God's kingdom is about. It is about this small little thing making a big impact in the world. And again, we've seen that. We've seen that because we know what people have done to show us personally God's love in the world. And we have taken part in that and shown that to the people, to God's creation. I wish we could stop there. I really do, because that's like the happy stuff, right? But then later, Jesus takes the disciples, and he's still on this whole ball of the kingdom of heaven is like, and he tells them that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. A guy finds a treasure in a field, sells everything that he has, and buys the field because he's so excited that he has the treasure. It's about a guy who finds God, who finds Christ in his life, and gives up everything to have it in his life. This tonal shift continues, because then we get the one of the pearl, which is kind of similar in a little bit of a sense if we're thinking about it. A merchant in search of fine pearls. He finds one, just one. And he sells everything that he has and bought it. Just one. I know pearls are expensive. Like, I know how pearls are made. I was explaining to someone the other day, you can actually go buy an oyster and have it open, and you get the pearls that are inside. It's this really weird thing that they do. Sometimes you get really lucky and you get like an extra special one or something, but sometimes you don't. So imagine finding one single pearl, which again, those aren't even that big. And now I know that they're not that big because my mom used to love pearls. She wore pearls all the time. So they're not that big, but you find one, just one, you get rid of everything that you have for this tiny little thing that, believe me, can be lost. And I know it can be lost because my mother lost pearls in a game of Hungry Hungry Hippos before. That was the most expensive game we ever played at that point, I'll tell you what. But again, this tiny little thing worth so much that you get rid of everything and you grab it. Because that's what following Jesus is like. And then we get the story of the fish, right? Which really is kind of a retelling of the wheat and the weeds story, but with extra steps and with fish. This knowledge that eventually there will come this time where the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous, are going to be separated. That we're not going to have to worry about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as it were. That we will exist fully in the kingdom of God. It's this tonal shift that makes a huge difference. Because what it is calling for is reckless abandon, trusting in God's promises. And that's terrifying. To lose everything that you have for one thing. To get rid of everything that you have for one thing. And the promises that you have, that everything is going to be fine, it's not a right now thing. I get so frustrated with this pop theology that treats Jesus like Santa Claus. Like, oh, say the magic words and you get a Corvette or you hit the lotto. And if you did it wrong, well, it's because you lack faith. No. God does not promise us to have the easiest life possible. What God promises us is that God is with us. And that eventually, somehow, some way, everything works out in the end. That's the hope. That's the prayer that we have. But in order to get that, you have to be reckless. You have to be willing to put everything on the line to follow God. And you're listening to this and you're like, can we just go back to the happy part? And you can't. Because that's not the way the world works. In our reading from Romans, we have to remember a couple things. Number one, the question is, why would Paul be using these words of encouragement? To understand that, we have to understand the context of Romans. A lot of times Romans gets boiled down to being like this individualistic book, right? Like we talk about the Romans road in order to obtain salvation, some people will say. We talk about Romans 7, how we know what we're supposed to do, but I can't do it, Paul says. He makes it very personal, uses I statements and things like that. So Romans becomes a very individualistic book, except that the context in which it was written was to a group of people, to a community. It was not meant to just be like, there was no one person named Roman. It was to a church in Rome. And it's written in this context of pain and suffering, because I don't know if you know this about Paul, but when his life got turned upside down, what happened was he gets thrown in jail, like a lot. A lot of the work and the writing that he did while he was in prison. Because he paid attention. He gave up everything he was to follow God. The point of this passage that Paul talks about is that this present age of suffering and pain will end. It's going to stop. And it's going to stop because God's purpose will be established here on earth. In short, everything eventually will be all right. It's encouragement. It's the encouragement that Paul needs personally for what he's going through. It's the encouragement that the church needed at that time for what they were going through. And it's the encouragement that we as followers of Jesus some 2,000 plus years later need today. And we need this encouragement because we paid attention and we understand that doing what we are called to do, to being the disciple of Christ, is hard. It's very difficult. I can't help being who I am. And what I mean when I say that is, immediately when I read this and I think about this, my mind instantly goes to my friend and the conversations we have had about the effectiveness of superheroes, specifically Batman. I hold and maintain that if Batman, Bruce Wayne, would take all of the money that he has and invest in infrastructure, schools, things like that, instead of little bat-shaped boomerangs to throw at people and punch clowns in the face, he would do a lot more good. Raise up the working class. Give the police what they need in order to fight the evils of this world. But no, have a rubber suit and go kick people in the face. The villain is always going to get out of prison. That's just the way it works. Now, you could argue that this is because of a number of things. Primarily, these are all made-up stories, and a story has to have an antagonist. But there's not just that. Earthquakes, tornadoes, fires. I remember when 9/11 happened that Marvel put out very special comics showing the superheroes helping out. Even the villains came and helped out because of how horrible it all was. The point being this, and there have been stories about this, it never stops. There's not a day off. There's always going to be another villain. There's always going to be a natural disaster. There's always going to be something that happens that the hero has to deal with. There are no breaks when you're trying to save the world. That's why it's called the never-ending battle. And I hate to say this, but that's what we're engaged in. Not an actual battle, but this notion of what we do and how we do it. It doesn't stop. there's always something else. There's always someone else. There's always something else that we have to do. And the worst part is, you don't know if it's going to work or not. That's the nature of the world. We can do everything right. We can follow God. We can help people. We can do what God has called us to do. But at the end of the day, you're left with this nagging feeling in the back of your head, which is it actually going to help? That's why we have the starfish poem. Because it mattered to that one. The point is that following Christ is difficult. We have chosen to follow Christ. We have been called by God, and we follow God because of God's call in our lives. We mark ourselves as different. We do things differently. We live our lives differently. When you live your life with God at the center of it, there is no way for you to have a normal life. But what is normal? There's no such thing as normal. Normal is a setting on the dryer. We live our lives with God at the center, and what happens? There's pain, there's heartbreak, there's loss, there's grief. We give of ourselves, and we have to stop and think, why? It's very easy for followers of Christ to lose faith because they don't know if it's working, because we don't see the results. Martin Luther King Jr. famously spoke of this. He's like, I'm not going to see the top of the mountain. I know this. Like, he knew he was not going to see a place of like racial equality in his lifetime. He's like, but I know we're going to get there. Because he had that belief, he had that faith. How can someone have that level of faith? And it's because you pay attention to the book. The Spirit groans with us, that God is with us, that there is nothing that is going to separate us from the love of God. Height, depth, heaven, hell, powers on earth, anything. None of that is going to separate you from God's love. The belief in a better tomorrow. That's the reason, friends. That is why we endure and do what we are called to do. Because we believe in a better tomorrow. God doesn't sit back and do nothing. God is with us. Even when we don't feel it or see it, we know and we believe that God is with us because of the promises that God has made for us, that all things work together for those who love God and are called to God's purpose. You can't run from God. Good luck. That's the fastest way to end up in the stomach of a whale, is to try to run from God. You can't outrun God's love. There is no place that you can hide from that. And if you can't outrun God's love, you know what that means. You can't outrun God's grace and God's mercy and God's peace. Even in the midst of the things going on, you can't get rid of it. I like that. I like that notion because it gives us that hope that we need, that spark to continue. There are reasons why people like stories of heroes, because they don't give up. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, as we are wont to do, and he was, explaining. He's like, "Yeah, you've had a year, buddy." I'm like, "Yeah, I have." He said, "Hey, Sam, do you remember that time there's that story in Spider-Man where the time traveler came back, Cables?" "Yeah, I remember." And how he acted like it was such a big honor to meet Spider-Man. I was like, "Yeah." He said, "Do you remember why?" He said, because in that story, he's talking about everything that Spider-Man did in the past and how it made an effect in the future. And he was never going to get to see that, but he got this glimpse into knowing that the work that he was doing paid off. And I don't know if you know this, but that character specifically, Spider-Man, he just, like, it's always horrible for him at times, especially when Marvel editorial gets involved. That's neither here nor there. But, like, famously, horrifying things happen to Spider-Man on a daily basis, where he has quit and given up several times, but he keeps going back to it because of this notion of power and responsibility. And to hear those words, that the work that you have put in here and now is going to pay off, it gave him the hope that he needs to continue. Friends, I am here to tell you today, it's worth it. It may not seem like it at times. I know I'm not going to get to see that idealized place. Not in my lifetime. I'll have to wait post-mortem and all that. But I know it's there. And I know that it's worth it. God gives us the strength and the courage to do what is necessary. We can do everything because God is on our side. Amen.